It's the Eds Files. Hello, I'm Dallas Kachan. With me here today, Michael Middlemiss, Managing Director of Asia Pacific for Edsby. Michael, kia ora.
Kia ora, Dallas.
Kia ora. If you're not familiar with the phrase, kia ora is the common greeting in New Zealand. It's the language of the New Zealand indigenous people, the Maori. We're going to talk and learn more about the Maori here in just a moment. But while we're doing intros, Michael, share some of your background. What were you doing just before joining Edsby?
Yeah, sure. So before joining Edsby in late 2018, I had the privilege and pleasure of working at the New Zealand Parliament, where I was the Chief Information Officer there. So as you can imagine, a very interesting and complex environment to work in. Lots of challenges, lots of different opinions, lots of different demands and needs, and all of them urgent. And that was a very exciting time. Prior to that, so I was at Parliament for about 8 years. Before that, I'd worked in and out of the public sector based here in Wellington, including the Tertiary Education Commission at one point, as well as in the private sector, providing services around the public sector mostly.
So, no stranger to large projects, change management.
A lot of those over the years. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us from Wellington, New Zealand. As mentioned, we mentioned Maori a moment ago. Help those who don't know about the Maori understand their role in New Zealand's history and their role in the country's culture today.
So Māori are the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, and they're part of the wider Pacifica community. And when New Zealand was colonised, there was a document, a founding document in New Zealand called the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed between the colonisers and the indigenous people of New Zealand. And that treaty set out the rights of the people of New Zealand, the indigenous people, and how the new colonial government would respect and honour those rights and look after them, and how we would work together going forward as one people while still recognising their own unique cultures.
Give us some examples of how Maori culture is infused into New Zealand's pop culture today.
So over the last few years, we've seen a great resurgence of te reo, which is the Māori language that got close to dying out in the between 1950s and 1970s. It was what you'd probably call a dying language, and that's come back hugely, and that's widely used across all people in New Zealand. There's many words that we will inject in an English conversation, which are te reo words, but they're just so colloquially used that it's just part of our language. Māori are spread around the whole country. They were traditionally the more populous in the North Island and up the top north, and we work very closely together. So, for example, all government departments in New Zealand have an English name and a Māori name. Most broadcasts in New Zealand will change between te reo and English. So it's very, very mainstream.
Can you share some of the characteristics of the Maori social system and the family unit and some of the language that's used and how it shapes the education system in New Zealand?
Yeah, for sure. So unlike a Western or a European family, Māori work in extended families. So they're called whānau. And whānau can be anything from direct blood relatives to kamatua, which are elders or respected people that live nearby. And they're all involved in, you've probably heard that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And that's exactly how they work. They work together to bring up their mokopuna, their children. And it's not uncommon for extended relatives to look after children from different parents, and it's also not uncommon for them to get together. They live on or don't live on, but they have meeting houses called marae, and marae are very very important to culture and to the communities, the extended communities. Iwi and Hapu are the different tribes and sub-tribes that they affiliate with and belong to.
Thanks. The Edsby Social Learning Platform for K-12 was selected by the New Zealand Ministry of Education in 2019. It's a big deal whenever a country or a state or a province picks just one thing for everyone to use. What problems were the New Zealand ministry first trying to solve by adopting Edsby?
So New Zealand has a slightly different education system to most countries in the world. So we don't operate in districts or big gatherings of schools that report into a single overarching authority. We have about 2,500 schools in the compulsory education sector. So that's like primary,
And why
intermediate,
is
and
that, Michael? Why? Why is it
um,
structured
so there was a reform introduced in the late 80s, early 90s called Tomorrow's Schools. And the whole idea around, well, one of the ideas was to give more influence and input to local communities about how their schools operated. So more say for parents around how a school, what the school's values were, how they operated, what they focused on, more opportunities to be involved. So every school in New Zealand is almost like a private entity, if you like, a separate company, and they all have a board of governors, and these are elected from parents. And so the board is like board of directors. They provide governance advice and make sure that the school is meeting its legislative requirements and all those sorts of good things. And the school has a lot of independence. They have their own budgets, for example. They have a lot of independence around decision making on what they want to invest in, where they want to focus. And as long as they're meeting the core legislative requirements, there's freedom to operate, and that direction comes from the board of directors. So when you've got this fragmented or autonomous system like this, one of the benefits or one of the great things is you end up with a lot of choice. Um, One of the downsides is you end up with a lot of choice. And so you end up with a very fragmented environment, ecosystem, and particularly in IT. So what was happening is there was a lot of choice in the student information system space, as an example. And that meant that for a very small country, remembering we're a long, skinny country with a population now of just over 5.5 million or so, um, you had a lot of different options in that market, and there was no national standard at the time. There was no um, way to make sure that all the information that was going into a school student information system was then able to be pulled out and moved to the next school so that the next school had that information. And one of the unique characteristics, I guess, of New Zealand, it's not unique, but one of the main characteristics of New Zealand, like I said, long, skinny country, very focused on primary produce in the primary sector. And as a result, we have a lot of farmers. You know, we're known around the world for the quality of our butter and our cheese and our milk. And you have a lot of share milkers and nomadic people that move around from farm to farm, and they could be doing this 3 or more times a year. And their children go with them, obviously. And so that meant that you had kids moving into a different school 3 or more times a year. And every time they started at the school, they would go through the entry assessment again to see, get an understanding of what level they're at and what support they needed. And if they had funding attached with them for learning support needs, for example, or maybe they had a support teacher assigned to them, or maybe they had funding for a disability and it meant that the school could buy a ramp so they could get into classrooms easier. So it could be something as simple as that. That funding's usually attached to the student. And because that information wasn't traveling with the student, neither was the funding. And so the new school would have to go through that whole application process again. And by the time the school had actually got to understand what the student needed, um, got an understanding of what support was in place for them at the previous school, so they could arrange for it at their school, it was about time for them to pack up and move to the next school. So there was a lot of kids just going through this churn cycle, and they weren't making a lot of progress, or weren't making the progress they could have otherwise.
So the ministry decided to do something about it, decided to talk to the outside world, seeking vendors' assistance here. Did it try to build its own solution?
So interestingly, there's been a number of attempts at solving this problem over the years. In fact, I don't know, you may remember we both worked for a previous company called First Class, which was in the same educational space and was a collaboration platform, and it was aimed at sort of making information accessible. And even back in those days, we were working with the ministry over here, looking at if there was something we could do to help get that information moving around. So it's been thought about for a long time. There's been a couple of attempts at it. I don't think there was ever an attempt to build something specifically. There were systems put in place that were based on standards such as FTP and all those sorts of things. But in about 2016, the ministry went out to a request for information, or RFI process, which they released internationally, looking for a vendor who could provide a solution that would enable them to integrate with, as a starting point, these 6, 7, 8, 9 different student information systems that were in the market, take that information and standardize it, and then make it available to the next school. And Edsby was shortlisted through the RFI process, and then subsequently went on to win the RFP.
Why? Why Edsby?
This was obviously before I became on the scene, but my understanding is from the conversations I've had since then is that it was one of the few products or platforms that could actually meet the requirements. There were all the security aspects were ticked off. We had the scalability requirements. And one of the things that Edsby, through its Unison technology, does really well is data integration. So we have some amazing tools that allow us to talk to most systems that will talk to an outside system and take that information and make it available to other systems in a way that they understand.
You mentioned Unison. For what it was first calling CC, the Student Information Sharing Initiative, the New Zealand Ministry licensed what we call Edsby today. But now that same core technology has been spun out, that the same core technology that initially got the ministry so excited, it's now called Unison by Edsby. Talk a bit about the specifics of what Unison is now and how it came to be and how it's being used.
So, I mean, Unison is all about unifying the information we know about a learner and bringing it into a single pane view. So, taking New Zealand as a great example, as well as all the student management systems, there's a dozen or more sector systems run by the ministries and different government departments that are repositories for specific pieces of information. So you have assessment systems, you have funding systems, you have health systems, all those sorts of systems, learning support needs systems, and all those siloed systems hold pieces of the puzzle. And so what Unison is all about is bringing all of that information together into a single pane view that allows you to pull together a lifelong record of learning for the learner. So everything that's been a milestone or important or significant to know about that child can travel with them and stay in that single view. And when CC, that was the original name for the project, now known as Tarito, when CC started, and then now we've moved on a bit, that it was envisioned that it would be a headless system. So there wasn't going to be this user interface that people would log into. It was going to be a system that ran in the cloud that pulled the data in every night from all these different systems, aggregated it all up, and when it identified that a student had moved to a new school, go, hey, here's everything we need. We know already about the student. Here you go, so you're ready.
Tarito, you mentioned the name Tarito. What was
Yes.
formerly called CC is now Tarito, you say?
Yeah. Yeah, so the project, as it sort of expanded and grew, there was a period of pause after a bit of a rethink about what we were trying to achieve, and there was a couple of sector groups that were set up, and this is where this project is quite different to anything else I've worked on and anything else I think the ministry have worked with, and that there was a strong governance input by two working groups the Māori medium and the English medium. Ngāra Whakatapu is the name of the working groups. And these are made up of active principals of schools who represent what those principals and what those schools need and want out of the system. And there's two, like I said, there's two groups. There's the Aoraki group, which is the English medium group, and there's the Māori group, which is the Māori medium group. So we have two curriculums in New Zealand, English medium, Māori medium. But we also have schools that teach the Māori immersive without necessarily going their full curriculum. So there's full representation there. And those groups meet together. We put governance level decisions up to them, and they are actively involved in decision making around the direction of the project and what will be next.
If Te Rito is being given the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and is being entrusted with student data for the entire country, let's talk data privacy. What kinds of measures has Edsby put in place to protect student data? And is the ministry satisfied that Edsby is doing everything that it should be?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about learner data and you talk about children, you're talking about some of the most sensitive information that you can collect about anybody, right? And so privacy and security is paramount. And so Edsby ourselves, we've been through a rigorous process of, we're now fully ISO 27001 certified. That was a key requirement from any vendor that worked with the ministry, is to be able to demonstrate that they have those strong understanding and practices and processes around security. We go through extensive annual penetration testing, for example. We go through exercises to make sure we have full failover and data redundancy and things like that. So the public sector has a very high bar around security. It's all prescribed in manuals and processes and documents that you have to undergo. The Te Rito platform has been through all those and is accredited to those levels. So we definitely take security very seriously.
You mentioned the acronym ISO 27001. Can you get a bit more color on what that is?
Yeah, so ISO is an international standard. It's an international standards organisation, and basically it's agreed best practice around management. And there's many different ISO standards. The particular one that we were focused on was ISO 27001, which is around assurances around security and assurance. And what that sort of says to anybody who is ISO 27001 certified, and it's an independent certification process. You can't just self-certify, you have to go through an accreditation. And that sort of says that you have the processes in place and the practices in place and the understanding in place around privacy, data protection, what publicly identifiable and personally identifiable information is and how it should be treated differently. And you have the systems and components of your solution are all in the scope of that accreditation.
It's an exciting time for Edsby right now. The New Zealand Ministry of Education, since licensing Edsby for the whole country, has expanded the scope of what it wants to use Edsby for. It's no longer just pursuing electronic student records that follow the student. Describe the ministry's new vision for its use of Edsby and where the project is at today.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, when the project started, the vision was that there would be this headless system. There wouldn't be somewhere that people log in to get the information. We would gather the information and then send it out to the student management systems when we identified a new student was enrolled at that school. I think longer term, that is still something we will do. But for now, what is happening is that after a very fairly public privacy breach in the public sector in 2019, everybody stepped back a bit, took some time to assess their security, double check assurances around processes, systems, technology, and Te Rito itself. It was proven to be very secure, and there was no concerns around there. There was a concern around once the ministry collected the information, supplying that to an external system. And while they wanted to take time to go out and do proper assurance around the vendors we're sending data to, which is a process that's ongoing, a decision was made to make it a one-way a data feed solution. So data was coming in to Toreto, but we weren't sending anything out at this stage. And as a result of that, there was a rationale and a good driver to enable a lot more, or enable all of the core platform user interface and the full Edsby experience. So now to access the student record of learning and the information that's traveling with the student, principals and teachers log in to Toreto, which gives them not only access to that full record of learning for the student, but all the other collaboration features that the platform supports. And there's a very exciting project underway at the moment around rolling out the collaboration groups and enabling groups of like-minded people with common interests or profession to work together. So, for example, a group of all Year 9 science teachers working together on learning material and professional development, which is something that's not easily achieved at the moment.
Across all schools in the country.
Cool. Yeah, and then there's special interest groups as well. So we're working on a pilot at the moment with Ko Takareo, which is the New Zealand Deaf School. And now they have some main campuses, but they also have a lot of outreach. You know, they've got outreach in hundreds of other schools, so thousands of students across hundreds of schools that they struggle at the moment to collaborate with. And through the rollout of Toreto, they will actually be able to have those interest groups that those students are able to access and be able to work with them in that manner. So it's very exciting.
And to be clear, this is regardless of what the SIS is that a school has chosen, regardless of the rest of its infrastructure. This is a centralized system that every teacher and, in theory, students can use to collaborate amongst themselves, regardless of their IT infrastructure.
Yeah. So we work closely with the vendors, SMS vendors, student information system vendors in New Zealand, and we're integrating with them and pulling in that data. And then the ministry have a sector-wide authentication system, education sector logon, which is used by registered teachers and principals and staff. So we again have integrated with that, and that's how they all authenticate in. And we're working through how to get the students in, probably using just out of the box Edsby OAuth 2 functionality. So
I want to rewind on something you said 5 minutes or so ago about a public sector data breach in the New Zealand government. That wasn't Edsby, to be clear, right?
it was not Edsby, no. It was in a different. It was in the public sector, but it wasn't in the education space at all.
Understood. But as you said, it caused a rethink, a re-examining across every asset in the government's portfolio, regardless of department.
Yeah, it was significant enough that everybody wanted to stop and just make sure they were doing as much as they can to protect personal information that they are responsible for looking after and holding. And that's one of the things that's also interesting about this project is that the ministry don't see the data in Toreto as theirs. It belongs to the sector. They are providing this service on behalf of the sector. We're custodians of the data for the sector. So in fact, the ministry can't actually access any of the data in Toreto itself. So this really is a service that's being provided for the sector to use and benefit from.
Michael, in our last few minutes here today, what can other states and provinces and countries learn from New Zealand's work with Edsby over the last few years?
I think the first takeaway is it's really hard. It sounds easy on paper. You think, yeah, it's a great idea. It is a great idea. Nobody ever questions the idea. It's good. The intentions are good, but it is a fundamental sector change, and it takes time. And so it's going to take longer than you think. It's going to take an investment not only from the ministry and the education authorities, but from the sector themselves. And I think one of the great findings or learnings from this project is how the ministry has worked with the sector representatives to enable and make things happen. And we wouldn't have progressed as far as we have today without that shared co-governance engagement. So it's got to be It's got to be sector, if not sector led, then at least sector involved. You've got to understand what you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve it, have that very clear messaging around that, and expect to take a long time to get it done.
And that there's an important role for open standards to play and other standards.
Yeah, correct. So there's, as anybody in the education sector will know, there's a lot of what we call legacy information systems out there, and so they've just been around for a long time. They're still being used because they're great and they're good at what they do. But at the time they were developed, there wasn't necessarily a data interchange standard, and so you have to talk to them in a what we call a bespoke way. So it's very specific. Instead of a common language, you're talking their own language. And what we are slowly introducing in New Zealand is we've implemented a common standard called CIF. There's different variants of it: CIF US, CIF AU for Australia, CIF UK, and now CIF New Zealand. And over time, as vendors move to CIF, there's that standardized understanding or descriptor of what the information is, and that is then stored in what's becoming an education sector data model as well, which was something that wasn't previously there. So in the future, that means people will be able to speak the same language.
Michael Middlemiss, Managing Director of Asia Pacific for Edsby, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you
For the Eds
me.
Files, I'm Dallas Kachan. Thank you for watching.